So I want to speak a bit about Harry Wu and the Laogai system in China. The reason I'm raising this now is because Mr. Wu has just passed away at 79, and the world has lost one of its bravest human rights activists. Um, I had been familiar with this man before, though admittedly not in very great detail. So, in order to prepare for this video, I've done a little bit of research and I've watched a number of clips of him and I was familiar with the fact that he was known as Chinese Solzenitsyn because, well, I should give a bit of a basic biography. In 1957, at the age of at the age of 20, Harry Wu was part of college debate, so to speak, on the Soviet revolution or the Soviet invasion, I should say, of Hungary, which was a very brutal invasion of that country. Garnered a lot of sympathy in the West, and a lot of innocent people were killed. And that was really one of the first big events that showed the West that this is what communism is. So anyway, he was one of the students who criticized the Soviet Union um, for its approach. A few years down the line, he found himself arrested following the so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Um, in fact, 1960, this was before the Cultural Revolution, but this was now well into Mao's time in power. So he was arrested and sent to the notorious Laogai system, which is basically a very large, extensive system of prison camps designed specifically for dissidents. So these are not regular prisons for, thieves and rapists and so on, but basically a political prison system, a gulag system. And he served 19 years in those conditions. The conditions were very harsh. He was put in solitary confinement, very small, cramped like conditions. He was virtually worked almost to death. He lost 6 stone in that time. When he was finally released in 1979, which is 3 years after Mao's death, at that time there were a number of releases because Mao had died. I don't know whether that was the reason, it's just that he'd served his time. But many others died within this Gulag system. He came out and there was no one to meet him. His father had passed away. His mother committed suicide when she found out that he had been detained. And they had also killed his younger brother. Now, Harry Wu was a Catholic, but in all the sources I've looked at, I haven't found that that was part of the reason for his arrest. That the main emphasis seems to be this critique of the Soviet Union, which was, of course, the leading communist state of the time. Mao's China was still a long way to go technologically before it caught up with the Soviet Union. So obviously, this was a case of the Chinese Communist Party sort of don't know whether you would call it defending their Soviet comrades, but it was basically a case of um, you know, you you rub my back, I'll rub yours. Anyway, the reason he got this name of Chinese Solzhenitsyn is because he then dedicated his life to exposing this. He got invited by the University of Berkeley to the United States in 1985, 6 years after his release. And initially, when he was over there, he didn't focus that much on human rights. He just wanted to focus on getting on with his own life and saving money. But over time, he began to realize that he had to speak out against this because the system was still very much in operation. And I've just watched a very interesting speech by Harry Wu at the Oslo Foundation, Oslo Human Rights. I forget the exact title, but I'll try and put a link in this video. Um, so this was a brave man who dedicated his life to human rights. And just to be clear here, um, he was not a criminal in any general sense of the word. He never used violence. He was never involved in terrorist activity. He never done anything that in any rational human way would justify 19 years in prison, and a very harsh prison system at that. Now, the video is from 2011, and in the video he talks about his disappointment that respective US presidents hadn't vocally condemned this Laogai, so-called Laogai system. And he said that President Obama told him directly that he would condemn it, but Obama never went on to do that. I think one issue now with China and human rights is that I don't think it's necessarily a case that the West is scared of China, but the West treads very carefully because of trade. This is definitely the case of my own country. George Osborne, our Chancellor, has essentially alluded to the fact that he's not going to make it a major issue on his official business with the Chinese. And in turn, the Chinese Communist Party has praised him for that, saying this is a Western leader who knows the right approach to take to China. In other words, he's being a good boy and keeping his mouth shut. And I know it's not an easy thing to do for anybody to stand up to this sort of totalitarianism. But in my opinion, if a brave man like Harry Wu can do it, then the leaders of the comparatively free world should. And I fully understand the complexities of trade. This is why I know it's not a simple issue, but frankly, it makes my stomach turn, this idea that we basically say nothing in exchange for trade deals. It is true that China is a major economy, but what also needs to be remembered is China relies on the rest of the world just as much as the rest of the world relies on China. And China does rely on Western countries because they cannot just have a sustainable trade with countries like Pakistan and other Asian countries. They know that they rely on the West. So I really do think that I don't think it's practical to, for example, say at a press meeting in front of the world, you know, Mr. Xi, your country has a barbaric human rights record. We shame you publicly. I understand that wouldn't be feasible because the Chinese would just, the Chinese government would just want revenge, and you know, they turn around and say, okay, you're not getting the trade, or they'd go into one of the rambling sort of critiques about minding one's own business and all this sort of thing, ignoring the fact that human rights is a universal principle. And as I always say with these videos, well, there's one area I disagree with Harry Wu. He says the United States is a free country. Um, it is free insofar as it's democratic. However, it's not got a perfect human rights record either. I mean, America has solitary confinement, um, so it's not got a perfect human rights record. Anyway, towards the end of the video, there was a few cynical overtones here because he was suggesting that the Communist Party relies on this basic gulag system in order to survive. However, he did say that he was optimistic for the future, at least he alluded to that by 2037, the communist regime would no longer be there, in his opinion. I think it's very difficult to tell at this stage. It all depends what happens in the next 7 years, and i.e. the remainder of Xi's tenure. For me, one of the hardest things about discussing human rights when it comes to China is not necessarily the attitude of the Chinese government, because that's predictable. They deny it and they make excuses and then they just try to reflect. And the people who are in power now come from the very same system that Mao Zedong came from. And that's the difference with China and Russia. In Russia, okay, I'm no fan of the Putin regime, but Putin's no communist. So it's true he was a KGB officer, but where you get examples of other governments that have enacted a lot of human rights abuses, there is at least a degree of transparency that China doesn't have. I mean, in the case of Cambodia, for example, the Khmer Rouge leaders have been put on trial. And there's been other examples, especially in Latin America, whereby during the Cold War there were horrendous human rights abuses committed by both sides, right wing governments and left wing governments. And I think in my opinion, South America has come a very long way, and South America can be comparatively proud of how far it has come, because the number of democracies in South America now far weighs the number of authoritarian regimes. In fact, in South America, I can only think of one that has autocratic tendencies, and that is the regime in place in Venezuela. That's not to say that there isn't corruption and there isn't problems in other governments, but I think everything needs to be put in context. Everything needs to be compared to a previous time, i.e., is it better now than it was? That's always the hallmark question. But anyway, I said that the Communist Party is predictable, but I think the harder problem actually lies in nationalism, and it lies in especially overseas Chinese who get very, very defensive when these sort of issues are raised. And on one hand, that's sort of understandable because I've always considered nationalism to be a tribal mindset. Nobody likes to hear criticism of their country. Nobody does. But what I've always contended is true patriotism is recognizing the moral shortcomings that your country has done. Now, one thing I respect a lot about President Obama is he didn't shy away from that. When he was running in 2008, and indeed early on in his presidency, he was very clear to say America has done immoral things. He was very vocal in that. Now, I still think that the United States has to be very careful who it allies itself with, especially regimes like Saudi Arabia. And Western countries, it is true that they are not squeaky clean when it comes to human rights. Britain is not squeaky clean. Even today, it's not squeaky clean, far from it. But the fundamental difference is, so what I'm saying is you can find examples of human rights violations virtually all over the world, but a fundamental difference between democracies where there are human rights abuses and single party regimes where there are human rights abuses is that at least in democracies, you have a different point of view. You have dissenting views that can be heard. You have dissenting views that, generally speaking, are not going to face arrest simply for expressing a view. Now, in a communist system, defense lawyers for environmental activists, human rights activists themselves end up getting harassed by the state. Um, Media is entirely controlled by the state. Now, I made a video a while back about the things I like about Chinese people, and I stand by every word I said in that. I think it's my honest experience. But one thing I don't like about especially overseas Chinese, and I have to be very careful how I say this, because frankly, a lot of my friends fit exactly into that category. A lot of the people I've made friends with have been overseas Chinese. So in ever if there's ever a chance of any of my friends seeing this, you should know me. You know who I am. So I'm just speaking about other people that I've experienced, and I'm not talking about everyone here. But it is a fact that there is too many overseas Chinese who have a, in my opinion, very extreme nationalist mindset. They just have this sort of blind defensive attitude towards the Communist Party whenever a foreigner says anything about it, even if they're saying it in their own country. There's this very aggressive defensive nationalism, like, oh, you Westerners mind your own business, or um, like I say, there was that time where the British journalist was interviewing the Chinese ambassador, and I got into a very verbal back and forth, and I have to admit it got quite heated because I was losing my patience with these people, with overseas people who I don't know if they were students or others, but they were basically attacking the British journalist for doing his job in Britain, in Britain. So I just got quite frustrated with their nationalistic attitude. And every time I made videos like this, there's been some positive feedback, but there's also always been nationalists who've come on to tell me how I'm wrong and how I don't know anything, etc. What I would say is this: everything that you know is based on communist sources. It's based on a completely biased point of view. So I'd be interested to see what sort of way they smear Harry Wu. So probably they'll try to say that, oh, he was a terrorist, or He was trying to cause unrest in the state. Not at all. Surely, if anything, Harry Wu is a patriot because he recognizes that for China to move forward, it has to change. That to me is patriotism. He's not calling for the downfall of China. What he is saying is the fact that so long as a single party remains in power, it's very difficult to see these things changing. It should be said, a few years ago, this issue was sort of being discussed, and Xi's Communist Party actually announced that they were dismantling the system. It's very difficult to say to what extent that has actually happened or not. On one hand, I want to be optimistic and think, okay, maybe they really are changing. Maybe Xi is serious about some of these reforms. And I remember when Xi was elevated to power, there was a lot of hope in China that, well, outside China, that Xi really would be a reformer. Because for one thing, he'd had experience living in the West, and he didn't come from that inner cabal of original Communist Party leaders. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. In that time, however, Xi has increasingly promoted a very nationalistic vision for China, and apart from the expansionist issue, which remains very controversial, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. Um, his party, just like its forebears before, has used ultranationalism as an excuse every time the human rights issue is raised. Now, here's the thing: people say countries should mind their own business; it's an internal affair, but I strongly disagree with that. China today is a very powerful country, and the Chinese economy is the second largest in the world. Hence, China has direct links to other countries. You cannot take China out of the equation. It's an absolutely central global player. So, in my opinion, it is absolutely legitimate that people are concerned as to what happens inside China, just as Chinese citizens and Russian citizens are concerned about the prospect of a Trump presidency. Americans can't turn around and say it's our internal affairs because America is a superpower. So it does affect other countries. And I would say the same thing about any superpower or great power. You can't turn around and say it's no one else's business. That's why I always say when people are criticizing my country, if I disagree with what they're saying, I will say so. But I never ever say this is an internal British affair, mind your own business. I never say that. China's part of the world, and Chinese nationals need to understand that. They cannot just take the attitude, oh, we could do whatever we want. No, actually, there's binding international agreements on basic human rights, especially on freedom of expression. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Um, and there's been numerous charters documented and agreed since then. I spoke a little bit longer than I intended here, but the issues are very important. Um, if any Chinese nationalists want to come onto this video and have a go at me, go ahead. But in the end of the day, this man served 19 years basically for a stance against the Soviet invasion of Hungary. That's what it was for. And even if he was incarcerated because he was a Catholic, again, that counters the argument that the major religions are technically permitted. So, with the passing of Harry Wu, the world does lose one of its great human rights figures, but I think it's also a time to reflect on the situation in China right now. The past is the past, but the question is to what extent has this really changed? China still carries out executions en masse. Now, to be fair, a lot of those people are genuine criminals. I don't think that the majority are dissidents. I think probably the majority are murderers and rapists and so on. And then, you can have the moral argument about the death penalty, but nevertheless, it leads away. It executes more people than the rest of the world combined. There is still virtually no free media. Um, Editors in Hong Kong who have been critical of the Communist Party have ended up murdered. Um, Environmental activists and so on get harassed by the authorities. So there is a very long list of human rights violations that continue to go on in China. And anyone who wants to deny this, as far as I'm concerned, you're just being tribal, you're being defensive. You just don't like the fact that a foreigner has an opinion on this. And, you could say what you want, but if you assume an ultra nationalistic position, then don't turn around and blame me for saying that you're a stooge of the party, because that's how you come across. If you're going to be so much objectivity to just absolutely get aggressive and say, "How dare you criticize us?" Blah blah blah. Then how can you blame foreigners for assuming that you are either employed by the party or you're brainwashed, one or the other? I don't necessarily think it is brainwashing actually, because I think it's more nationalism. Although I suppose you could argue the two are related. I mean, nationalism exists in the West as well. Yet there are Westerners who I would describe as being ultra nationalistic. So I'm not holding double standards to this. I don't like it wherever it is. I think it's a regressive way of thinking. I think people can love their country, care about their country, defend their country without being dishonest about their country. I saw a great quote about this yesterday. Unfortunately, I've forgotten it now, but it was contrasting patriotism with nationalism. In my opinion, the difference is, and I'm going to round this up because it wasn't the main emphasis of the video, but I think the difference is that patriots care a lot about their country, but they don't deny their country's problems. Nationalists just blindly defend their country's reputation. I'm not talking about the country like defending from the point of view of a soldier defending their country. I'm talking about just vocally defending their country, no matter what. I think that's a stupid mentality. And I say that about anyone. I hold exactly the same principle about anyone. So to any British person who wants to pretend that we're perfect and they just get really aggressively nationalistic, I think they're being idiots. Um, Final disclaimer. Sometimes when I make videos like this, people assume that I'm anti-China. Well, I'm not anti-China, and anyone who knows me knows that I'm not anti-China. Um, and I'm realistic enough to know that the Communist Party isn't going to go overnight. But I live in a country that does value free expression. So at the very least, I'm going to speak out and give my candid thoughts about what I think about brave people like Harry Wu and what I think of this appalling system. Because what the Communist Party actually does is turn people against dissidents. They sort of portray them as traitors and so on. People might say, well, why did he go to the United States? I would argue he had no other choice. Because there is a track record that even when dissidents have served their time, they continue to be harassed afterwards. So it's basically a case of be a slave and blindly agree to the system. This is the choice for dissidents. Or have some degree of liberty and move from China. I'm sure it was a heartbreaking decision for any dissident to move from their homeland, but they really do have no other choice. Dissidents have been killed by the regime. And I'm talking about executed, I'm talking about murdered by thugs who get employed to drag them out of their homes in the middle of the night. Um, so the Communist Party, history will record, has and had an utterly appalling record on human rights. It will never, they can't erase that from history. They can use as much propaganda as they want and as much nationalism as they want, but the cold, hard truth of history will never ever change. They can harass people, they can bully people, but they cannot change the facts of history. People say, well, history's written by the winners, so that's why the Westerners all. But the point is, in China, the Communist Party are the winners. That proves the point. Going to round it up there, but rest in peace, Harry Wu. I understand he was a Catholic, so although I'm an agnostic myself, for his sake, I do hope there is a heaven, and I hope he gets eternal peace there. He deserves it.